On January 5, 1757, a shocking act of violence unfolded as King Louis XV prepared to leave his daughter's apartment in Versailles. A mysterious assailant evading the royal guard lunged at the king and stabbed him in the chest. The monarch was wounded but miraculously escaped death. While the king received medical attention, the attacker, François Damiens, was apprehended. An ordinary-looking man, Damiens claimed to have acted on behalf of God and the people. His peculiar behaviour and mysterious statements ignited suspicions of a broader conspiracy. In the ensuing chaos, a sinister aspect of the royal court was revealed. Driven by fear and a desperate desire to uncover the truth, the king's guards subjected Damiens to a horrifying ordeal of torture. Even high-ranking officials participated in this barbaric act, their humanity overshadowed by terror and a thirst for answers. Despite the brutality of his treatment, Damiens remained defiant, refusing to name any co-conspirators. Ultimately, Damiens was found guilty of regicide and sentenced to a gruesome and protracted execution, a punishment designed to inflict maximum suffering and terror. Damiens was condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, one of the most brutal forms of capital punishment of the era. His punishment extended beyond his own suffering. His birthplace was to be destroyed, ensuring his memory would be erased. The task of carrying out this horrific sentence fell to the Sanson family, the hereditary executioners to the French crown. Charles-Henri Sanson was only 18 years old when he was summoned to assist his uncle, Nicolas Gabriel Sanson, in the torture and subsequent execution of Damiens. This marked the beginning of Charles-Henri's infamous career, which would later include executing King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution. In his memoirs, Sanson recounts the gruesome ordeal as follows.
The night of March 27th, 1757, we witnessed the hurried construction of the scaffold at the Place de Grève. There, in the heart of the city, stood the instrument of our grim duty, enclosed within a heavy wooden barricade. The next day, I accompanied my uncle, Gabriel Sanson, to the conciergerie, where we met our team of assistants that would aid us with the dreaded task. Soon after, we were joined by the court clerk, who was accompanied by 2 ushers. It was their intention to read the sentence to Damiens within his cell, but the staircase was too narrow for the entire group. Thus, it was decided to bring the prisoner to a ground-floor hall instead. They brought him to us in a leather sack, closed at the shoulders, leaving only his head exposed. As they removed him from this makeshift restraint, I saw a man broken yet defiant. Ordered to kneel, he listened to the litany of his crimes with a chilling composure. His eyes darted across the room. His face was pale, almost translucent, yet his gaze held an intensity that was both frightening and compelling. Once they had finished, Damiens asked the guards to help him stand. It was a simple request, but one that spoke volumes of his suffering. His lips moved silently, forming the words, my God," as if seeking solace in the divine. My uncle approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. Damiens flinched in fear, but he soon relaxed as the priest drew near. The priest signaled for the others to stand back and spoke quietly with Damiens, who prayed fervently. The priest's words seemed to have a profound effect on him. After their prayers, Damiens was offered food, but he took only a glass of wine, which he could not drink. He experienced a kind of spasm, which, early in my career, I often observed even in the most courageous of convicts, a violent tightening of the neck muscles that prevents swallowing. Afterwards, he was taken to the torture chamber where the councillors and judges waited for him. They questioned him once more, hoping to extract information about any accomplices who might have aided him. Their efforts, however, proved fruitless. When Damiens persisted in his silence, the judges informed him that torture would be the next course of action. Thus, the instruments of torture were brought forth and our assistants stepped forward. They fitted the iron boot to Damiens' leg, tightening the cords with brutality. A scream tore from his lips, his face contorted in agony as he teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. The surgeons examined him, their faces expressionless as they declared the fit harmless. With a strength born of desperation, Damiens opened his eyes and pleaded for a drink. Water was offered, but he refused, his voice a mere whisper as he begged for wine. His strength was waning. I could see it in his eyes. I helped him raise the cup to his lips, and as he drank, a deep sigh escaped him. He closed his eyes and murmured a prayer, his spirit seeking solace in the face of such inhumanity. We resumed the grisly task. For 2 hours, his torment continued, a relentless assault on the human spirit. After the 8th application of the boot, the surgeons intervened, their voices carrying a note of reluctant mercy. The judges, with their own discomfort evident, rose hastily to depart. The iron boot was removed, revealing the extent of the damage inflicted upon Damiens' leg. He attempted to rise, but his limbs refused to obey. His gaze fell upon his mangled body, with a look of sorrow in his eyes, while the surgeons tended to his wounds. The man had endured a fraction of the torment ordained for him. Damiens was then taken to the chapel within the conciergerie, where he was left in the care of the priest, while my uncle departed to oversee the final preparations. Upon reaching the scaffold, my uncle was met with a scene of utter chaos. One of the assistants, a man named Soubise, a curious moniker for one of our kind, was tasked with procuring the materials for the final, horrific act: sulfur, lead, wax, and resin. However, nothing had been acquired. Soubise was found to be hopelessly drunk and his task entirely neglected. Panic gripped my uncle as he realized the gravity of the situation. He demanded to see the materials the old drunkard was meant to buy. However, nothing had been acquired. Worse yet, he discovered the wood for the pyre to be damp and unsuitable for burning. Chaos erupted at the scaffold as assistants scurried. Everyone talked at once, while my uncle, overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibility, tore at his hair in despair. The arrival of the royal lieutenant brought a semblance of order to the chaos. He unleashed a torrent of abuse upon my uncle, threatening him with imprisonment for his negligence, and tasked me and another assistant to procure the remaining items. We scurried to buy the missing items from neighboring shops, but despite our frantic efforts, the presence of my assistant and the nature of our errand deterred merchants from cooperating. Fearful of association with such a gruesome affair, they refused to assist us. Our attempts were thwarted at every turn, leaving us no choice but to resort to forceful means to obtain the necessary materials. Upon our arrival, the final preparations were swiftly completed and the prisoner was made ready for execution. The delay in preparations had forced Damiens to wait on the scaffold steps, while the final arrangements for his death were made in full view. With chilling composure, he surveyed the scene, and in a rare display of compassion, he implored the magistrates to protect his wife and daughter, swearing he had acted alone. The assistants moved with practiced efficiency, binding Damiens tightly to the wooden platform. As the ropes cinched around his wrists and ankles, he glanced at his trembling right hand with the same resigned sorrow he'd shown his mutilated legs earlier in the ordeal. The brazier was then packed with burning sulfur and glowing hot coals, filling the air with a thick, choking stench. Damiens' arm was pulled out and lashed to an iron bar so that his wrist extended beyond the edge of the platform, exposed and vulnerable. Pale and sweating, my uncle approached the prisoner with the brazier trembling in his hands. Damiens' face tensed as its oppressive heat shimmered in the air. My uncle then proceeded to slowly pour the molten lead onto Damiens' outstretched hand. The liquid hissed violently as it met flesh, sending up a plume of sharp smoke. Damiens let out a scream so raw and piercing it seemed to silence the crowd. His body thrashed instinctively, muscles straining against the ropes, but the bonds held firm. The first stage of this punishment dragged on for 3 harrowing minutes. each second stretching into eternity. I saw the toll this ordeal was taking on my uncle. His hands trembled and his face drained of colour. It was clear he could no longer finish the task. Seeing him falter, I intervened by offering 100 livres to any assistant willing to take on the task. A valet named André Legris stepped forward, his face grim but determined, and took the brazier from my uncle's trembling hands. Legris continued with the ordeal, fulfilling each horrific clause of the execution without hesitation. The molten lead burned deeper into Damien's flesh, leaving his hand twisted and blackened. But we were far from finished. After the burning was complete, they moved on to the next stage of the sentence, each act more brutal than the last. The valet then grasped the specially made steel pincers, approximately 1.5 feet long. He began to slowly pull chunks of flesh from Damien's right leg, first the calf, then the thigh. Both arms were similarly mutilated, followed by the removal of his breasts. Although he was a strong and sturdy man, the valet found it incredibly difficult to tear away the pieces of flesh. As a result, he worked on the same spot 2 or 3 times, twisting the pincers as he did so. Each time he removed flesh, he left a wound approximately the size of a 6-pound crown piece. After the agonizing extractions with the pincers, Damiens, who had cried out in pain throughout the ordeal, raised his head to inspect the horrific wounds inflicted upon him. The valet then proceeded to dip an iron spoon into the pot of boiling potion and methodically poured it over each gaping wound, the searing liquid causing Damiens to cry out anew. Driven by a renewed resolve, we carried out the remainder of the sentence. The ropes, intended to be harnessed to the horses, were attached with cords to Damien's body. The horses were then harnessed and positioned alongside his arms and legs, one at each limb. Monsieur le Breton, the clerk of the court, approached Damiens repeatedly, inquiring if he had anything to say. Damiens remained silent. With each torment, he uttered cries resembling those attributed to the damned in hell. As we tightened the cords, he continued to defiantly raise his head to examine himself, despite the excruciating agony. Monsieur le Breton questioned him once more, receiving the same response. Several confessors engaged in extended conversations with him, and he readily kissed the crucifix. The horses strained mightily, each pulling with unrelenting force on a limb, their efforts guided by our hands. After a quarter of an hour, the procedure was repeated multiple times without success. The horses' positions were adjusted. Those tied to the arms pulled toward the head, and those tied to the thighs redirected toward the arms, resulting in the breaking of the prisoner's arms at the joints. Despite this, the attempts failed, and he lifted his head to examine himself once more. 2 additional horses were added to those pulling the thighs, bringing the total to 6, but this too proved ineffective. I informed Monsieur le Breton that further attempts were futile and suggested dismemberment, but he insisted on continuing. Despite renewed efforts, the horses failed again, one collapsing from exhaustion. As we gathered around him, Damiens, despite his unimaginable suffering, urged us to remain calm and to carry out our duty without harboring any ill will toward him. He humbly asked that we pray for his soul and requested the parish priest of St. Paul to remember him in prayer during the first Mass. After 3 more failed attempts to dismember the prisoner using the horses, the valet and I were left with no choice but to draw our knives. Severing the legs at the joints had proven futile, so we resorted to cutting through the flesh at the thighs. With 4 horses pulling, the thighs were finally torn away. The right first, then the left. This same gruesome method was applied to the arms, shoulders, and armpits. The flesh had to be cut nearly to the bone before the horses could fully detach the right arm, followed by the left. When all 4 limbs had been removed, the confessors approached Damiens to offer him spiritual counsel, but upon drawing near, they realized he was finally dead. Yet I witnessed movement. his lower jaw shifting as though attempting to speak. Later, both my uncle and one of the assistants admitted they had also observed subtle signs of life when we lifted his torso to position it on the stake. The dismembered limbs were tied to ropes and cast onto the stake erected within the enclosure positioned near the scaffold. The torso and remaining parts were covered with logs and brushwood, and the pile was ignited with straw. As decreed, the body was entirely consumed by fire. The flesh and torso took approximately 4 hours to burn. The execution of Damiens was a horrific experience, one that left a lasting impression on my soul. The dismemberment by horses was a spectacle of brutality, a final act of cruelty inflicted upon a broken man. Its impact on my uncle was even more profound. Unable to bear the weight of such a burden, he resigned his position as the royal executioner. In his place, he appointed me, his nephew, granting me a stipend of 2,400 livres. Thus began my sole responsibility for carrying out the ultimate punishment, a role that would define the rest of my life.
Charles-Henri Sanson would go on to oversee some of the most infamous executions in French history. As the royal executioner during the reign of King Louis XVI, and later the High Executioner of the First French Republic, Sanson administered capital punishment in Paris for over 40 years. By his own hand, he executed nearly 3,000 people, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette during the tumultuous days of the French Revolution. Throughout his career, Sanson faced the horror of public executions and the immense emotional burden they placed on him, all while being responsible for one of the most dreaded jobs in France. His memoirs serve as a chilling testament to the cruelty and barbarism of the time, offering a haunting glimpse into the life of man who was both a tool of the state and a witness to its most violent acts.